Hi there, I'm John Ivison. Welcome to the video. This week I am joined by Thomas Juneau, who is an Associate Professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa and a former Defence Analyst with the Department of National Defence. Thomas, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Something you tweeted recently that caught my attention, and I'd like to delve into it in a little bit more depth. You were talking about Donald Trump and the prospect of him winning the US election next year. You said he will hit the ground running, unlike in 2016, that he will pursue a protectionist, unilateral and anti-democratic agenda that would put Canada at the front line. And a direct quote, you said, "This is not a Trudeau versus Poilievre matter. It's a huge threat to Canada's security and prosperity." Now, this is not a theoretical risk. Online betting sites give Trump an 83% chance of winning the Republican nomination. A poll for The Economist this week puts him within 2 points of winning the presidency next year if it's a head-to-head battle against Joe Biden. And Trump has not been covert about what he will do if he does win. So what do you think might be the downside of a Trump presidency for Canada?
So I think the downside for Canada is major in the sense that if you think about Canada's fundamental national interest, it is the management of our relationship with the U.S. And, you know, in a way, and I realize it's a bit narrow to say that, but it's not inaccurate to say that it really is our only national interest. What's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Gaza, what's happening, you know, pick another hotspot in the world right now. It matters to us in a variety of ways. It can, in fact, impact our trade a bit. Sometimes we have diaspora communities that will be affected. We're seeing that especially now with the war in Gaza. But in none of these cases is the impact on us existential. And by existential, I'm putting the bar really high in the sense that our security and prosperity are majorly affected, not affected to the margins, not a political impact in terms of the debates that we're having domestically. The relationship with the U.S. is the one exception. Our prosperity is massively dependent on the U.S. North of 70% of our bilateral trade goes to the U.S. Our security is massively affected by the U.S. I mean, the war in Gaza and Ukraine doesn't directly affect our security. The U.S. does, the border, what the U.S. does for us in terms of the Five Eyes, in terms of NATO, in terms of NORAD, and the list goes on. So the bottom line, and we can unpack this a lot more in the next minutes, but what happens in our relationship with the U.S. is the one thing that can really affect us negatively. And there are really serious reasons to be concerned about what happens if Trump does win again in 2024. And as you said it very accurately, this is not a theoretical scenario. You know, for the sake of discussion, we can say that it's a 50-50 chance that he does come back to power.
Right. Now, you were part of a task force last year. They put out a report. It was ex-CSIS directors, former national security advisors, ambassadors, academics, high-powered group, not prone to scaremongering, I would suggest. And you suggested that the US could become a source of instability. The report called for Canada to rethink its relationship with the US. What would that look like in practice?
Yeah. So that report, and if I can just say that, I'm still very happy with that report. It's a year and a half old. We had 65 detailed recommendations on things that Canada could do to enhance its national security, some very ambitious ones, but a lot of narrow, precise ones that can even be cost-free in many cases on multiple fronts. And the U.S. was about a page out of 45 pages in that report. So just to put that quickly in context. Our fear in that task force, which, as you said, former deputy ministers of foreign affairs, of defense, 4 former national security advisors, former ambassador to NATO, and so on, specifically on the U.S. front, our fear was that an increasingly protectionist U.S. government, especially under Trump, but it doesn't have to be under Trump. It can be under another president. We didn't want to make this personal about Trump necessarily. An increasingly isolationist U.S., a U.S. that dismisses its traditional alliances. Think about NATO, partnerships. Think about the Five Eyes. That would represent a major threat to our national security. Let's just take the example of the Five Eyes for 1 second. A significant proportion of the intelligence that Canada's intelligence agencies have, CSIS, CSE, and if you define that more broadly, RCMP and CBSA, is information that we don't collect ourselves, that we receive from the U.S. So in that sense, we are very, very dependent. We are very vulnerable to the tap being not necessarily shut down, but at least weakened. You can make the same case on the defense front. So these people on the task force are very well aware of that reality, of that dependence and the vulnerability that comes from that dependence. So the fear was how exposed we would be if those scenarios do come to pass. The key part of your question is, what can we do? What can Canada do? That's a hard question, because it's very easy for us to sit down and say we're in serious trouble if Trump comes back to power. What can we do about it? And I think there's a few elements. The first one is what a lot of people call the donut strategy, which is the idea that Canada can best shield itself from a president in the U.S. that is not nice to us, for generally speaking, by developing relations all around that president. So hole in the donut and surround the president with the substance of the donut. That means Congress. That means state governors. That means business lobbies and so on. These are all actors who are more closely tied to the reality of the very close relationship between Canada and the U.S., which, yes, is hugely beneficial for us, but also benefits the U.S. About 34 out of 50 states in the U.S., 34 out of 50, we are the number one trade partner, right? So very easy for a guy in the White House to want a more protectionist agenda, slap a 10% tariff, et cetera, et cetera. But then go to the governor of Minnesota, go to the governor of New Hampshire, go to the governors of other typically northern states, but a lot of southern ones too, and then make the case to them. Same with the business lobbies, same with congressmen and women who represent these states that are very close to Canada. And use them to leverage them to try to protect ourselves. That's what we did in the first Trump administration. That's what we have to keep on doing, and I would say much more in an eventual second Trump administration. So donut strategy is the number one. Number two is diversification. That is not something you can do in 3 or 6 months. That takes years or decades. I think we should all be very critical of successive Canadian governments for having been complacent in the comfort of our warm relationship with the U.S., which, as frustrating as it can sometimes be, on the security and trade front, we have massively benefited from it. And that's just made us complacent in terms of not making the effort of investing in other relationships. We really need to do that quickly with South Korea, with Japan, with Australia, with the European Union, with Indonesia, and so on. That's number two. Number three, and there is no way around that, and this is something that, again, successive governments deserve a lot of blame for this. The current one, but its predecessors too, is having massively underinvested in our national security, defense, foreign affairs, intelligence capabilities. They are just hollowed out, right? This is something that we've discussed. You've written about that. That's been discussed extensively in public. There is no way around that. You can write the best strategy you want on paper, donut strategy or anything else. If we don't boost these capabilities significantly, we are extremely exposed.
Now, you mentioned it's not a partisan issue, but the Liberals at the moment are pursuing an agenda that is not popular with the Biden administration, never mind with Trump. A digital service tax that would put 3% on Amazon, Google, the online news bill, which is hitting Meta and Google. And the Liberals seem to be pursuing a strategy, which may be the core to their re-election, of accusing the Canadian Conservatives of far-right American-style politics. Justin Trudeau this week was talking about MAGA influence. Would a Poilievre government be more welcomed by Trump if he was back in the White House?
So lots of good points to unpack in that question. The first point that I'd make is that the history of Canada-U.S. relation under Liberal or Conservative governments here, Democratic or Republican presidents in the U.S., have always been marked by tension. We could spend forever, and academic historians love to do that. Who's better, who's worse? From my perspective here, I don't really care about that angle of the debate. The bottom line for me is that Canada has massively benefited from our relationship with the U.S. It's been a bit harder sometimes, a bit more difficult, softwood, whatever. We've massively benefited from it. And the risk is that could stop, period. And that is not something that is dependent on a liberal or conservative government here, and it's irrespective of the debate in the past on whether Democratic or Republican governments have been better for Canada in the past. Both have been good, bottom line. Right now, Is it helpful for the Trudeau government to weaponize, if you want, that anti-Trump feeling, which is fairly strong in Canada, against the current official opposition, conservative official opposition? No, I don't think that's helpful. Politically, you can understand why they would do that. In the event of a second Trump administration, Trump will remember that, not only what is happening now, but also what happened in the past. I mean, Trump deeply disliked Justin Trudeau. We know that, right? Just the personality of Trudeau, his politics, his style. We know that Trump deeply, deeply disliked that. And
Chrystia Freeland.
And Chrystia Freeland, absolutely. She just irritated him quite clearly. Does that matter in the bigger picture of the risk of a unilateral isolationist turn in a Trump 2 administration? It does, but I don't think it changes the fundamental reality of the threat that this poses to Canada. That's what I meant when I said on Twitter that you referred to, that it's not a partisan issue. Of course, in a way, it's a partisan and political issue. Politicians in a democracy politicize things, and you can't blame them for that, and you can't expect them to stop doing that. But would a Poilievre-led Canada be really better positioned to deal with a second Trump administration? I don't think so. And I don't think this is criticism of one or the other. I think that's just the reality that a Trump 2 would try to implement a much more unilateralist and isolationist agenda, putting at risk NATO, putting at risk the Five Eyes, putting at risk our bilateral trade. You can probably make a plausible case that Poilievre would be slightly better positioned because he wouldn't irritate Trump the way that we know that Trudeau already does. You can probably think that Poilievre would be fairly good at approaching Trump just because of a closer personality style, because Poilievre is very, very good as a communicator in general, especially to that kind of crowd. But would he be able to, more than marginally reduce the major potential threat to Canada? I doubt that. I hope so. And I say this on purely nonpartisan grounds, but I doubt that. Simply not because of Poilievre, not because of any limitations to what he can do, because of what Trump would try to do. That is simply the agenda he would seek to implement, Poilievre or no Poilievre, Trudeau or no Trudeau, and for that matter, Freeland or no Freeland.
Well, let's look at what Trump would try to do. I mean, he's laid out pretty clearly in some of his campaign speeches, which maybe people haven't been paying attention to quite yet, but let's look at a little bit more detail at that agenda. The main focus seems to be on the US-Mexico border and, in his words, stopping the invasion of our southern border to end illegal immigration. The language he's been using is shocking. Nothing much shocks me anymore, but this is pretty shocking stuff. He talks about immigrants poisoning the blood of our country. And an article in the Atlantic recently called that a permission slip to his supporters to dehumanize immigrants, and implying that the normal constraints that govern human interaction no longer apply, with all that implies. Trump says he has plans for mass deportations. He would use thousands of troops that are currently stationed overseas to help police the border. That would seem to me to have implications for our border, also for our defence alliances. Now, Trump has talked about fundamentally re-evaluating NATO. What do you think on the border and on the military alliances?
I think we have to take these declarations seriously. And a lot of the pushback that you see when people, myself, but multiple others, try to warn about the risks to Canada of a second Trump administration, the most common line, the first most common line would be, well, Trudeau is the problem, which I think is besides the point. That's taking our own domestic political, cultural wars to a much more fundamental foreign policy challenge. We talked about that in the previous question. The second most common pushback is, we survived Trump 1, we can deal with Trump 2, which is a point that deserves attention, but that ultimately, I think, fails. It is true that we survived Trump 1 relatively unscathed. If anything, and this is worth saying, as much as I'm critical of many aspects of the Trudeau government's foreign, defense, and national security policy, if there's one success that they've had over 9 years, it's the renegotiation of NAFTA. It looks easy in hindsight. It was not easy. It could have been far worse, and, give or take a few points. It's NAFTA 2.0, USMCA, CUSMA, whatever you want to call it, is equivalent in terms of its benefit to as NAFTA was for us previously. It's modernized in some ways. We survived that, and I think the Trudeau government that gets criticized rightly on so many things deserves points on that. Does it mean we could survive the next one? I don't think so, or I don't think it's automatic. When Trump came to power in 2016, basically he surrounded himself with what we often call adults, right? Traditional mainstream Republicans who had government experience. Think about James Mattis at Defense and a number of other ones within the White House, National Security Advisor, a number of his key secretaries at Treasury, Homeland Security, his chief of staff, which was former General Kelly, and so on. These were folks who spent significant amount of time restraining him, huge amounts of energy holding him back and preventing him from implementing his ideas, which at the time were very much undeveloped. Trump learned his lesson. And if you listen to what he's saying, but also pay attention to what he's doing, as opposed to just saying, he is surrounding himself with a team of people who are like-minded to him. They are preparing briefing books, transition books of hundreds of pages of very clearly detailed agendas, sector per sector, including, from our perspective, foreign affairs, trade, national security, to implement his agenda from day one. And he has learned what he perceives is his lesson, not to surround himself with what we would call adults, i.e. mainstream traditional Republicans, which you may or may not disagree with them as a Canadian. They are traditional mainstream Democrat, they respect principles of democracy, and they support policies that generally have been good for Canada. That will not be the case if Trump 2 comes in, and from day one, he will have people who will slap major tariffs. Again, here the pushback you get on the Canadian side is, well, Biden canceled Keystone. Okay, Biden, through the Inflation Reduction Act, imposed a few Buy America measures. That's not a big deal. That's the kind of thing that we've seen from American administrations for decades. That is minor leagues. It's minor leagues compared to what Trump will do in terms of protectionism. He will push hard to withdraw the U.S. from NATO. It's a cornerstone of our defense posture, NATO. He will actually act on successive American presidents who have for decades been irritated at our neglect of defense issues, for example, through NORAD, where we are still dragging our feet on modernizing NORAD and so on. NORAD is a keystone of our defense. And in the absence of NORAD, or in a weakened NORAD, even if NORAD doesn't formally die, same with NATO, we become much more isolated on the world stage, much more unable to defend ourselves on our own. And I could go on, right, with a number of other pillars of our foreign and defense policy.
Well, let's unpack a little bit. You talked about trade, and there is a proposal from Trump to put a 10% tariff on just about everything coming into the US. Do you think that the NAFTA 2.0, which his administration negotiated, would exempt us from that?
I mean, I have no idea. I mean, we can only speculate. It's always important here to make a difference between what Trump is saying, which we do have to take seriously, and what will actually happen. If he tries to slap a 10% tariff, which if he does, would cause massive damage to the Canadian economy, because again, we are so integrated and so dependent and vulnerable. That being said, because we are integrated, so is the U.S., right? Especially in a number of key sectors, a number of northern states, they're not as dependent as we are on them, but they still are. So you have to expect that the strategy of the Canadian government, again, going to my point on the donut strategy, would be to go to states, go to state legislatures and governors, go to business lobbies, go to the Congress in Washington, and really push hard to have exemptions from those tariffs. Would we succeed? I mean, I sure as hell hope we do, but I obviously have no idea. But even if we partially succeed, we are so dependent on the U.S. that some tariffs, and again, it would be worse than Biden. We have to get that out of our minds that, but Biden did it and we're okay. That's not the case. Would still cause massive damage. And I'm not an economist, I'm not an expert per se on trade, but the uncertainty that would come from the months, maybe more, of negotiation on these exemptions or not would just be a disaster for the Canadian economy in terms of drying out investment and so on. Just that uncertainty would be very damaging.
Right, I was going to mention investment. I mean, one of our biggest foreign export earner remains energy.
Yeah. And
on energy, Trump's talked about drill, baby, drill in ramping up oil drilling and offering tax breaks to oil, gas and coal producers, which rolling back incentives on electric cars and quitting the Paris Accord, all of which sounds like it would be bad news for investment in Canada.
Absolutely, and let there be no doubt about that. Again, not an economist, but the tariffs themselves would be an obstacle, other protectionist measures generally speaking, but the climate of uncertainty would just leave us very much exposed. And that's where the point about the crucial importance of diversifying our trade relations, which we've known for 50 years. I mean, Trudeau father in the 1970s tried to push what he used to call a third way. Successive governments have done this. They've all failed to various extents. I mean, the percentage of our bilateral trade going to the U.S. has stayed relatively constant, more or less, in the 70s. That just leaves us brutally exposed.
Just on a final point on water, the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence are the largest source of fresh water in the world. There are 45 million people relying on them for drinking water. We do have a US boundary water treaty, which stipulates water levels must not be altered without the consent of the other side. There is an international joint commission with the commissioners from each side. Do you think these niceties could be relied upon if climate change dries out the southwest and the US looks covetously on some of our water?
So a couple points that I'd make in answer to that. First of all, you mentioned, those niceties and those commissions and all there are dozens and hundreds of bilateral bureaucratic mechanisms that manage the extremely complex relations between Canada and the U.S. One of the things that actually made us survive Trump 1, which again was much easier, no doubt in my mind, than Trump 2 would be, was the reality of these extensive bureaucratic networks, which are not or very little politicized and continued unscathed by what was happening at the political level, especially in later years when the Trudeau-Trump relationship became so difficult. For a research project that I did with Stephanie Carvin, a book on intelligence in Canada, we interviewed a number of people in the U.S. intelligence community, and they all said the same thing. At the technocratic level, relations between the two countries continued because we were shielded because of the depth and proximity of these networks. So that water commission that you mentioned, that I'm not an expert on by any stretch, as long as it's not on the radar, you could expect very well that it's very important work that few people notice or care about, but it's still extremely important work, would continue. The issue often is shielding that from Trump's radar. The other point you mentioned more broadly on the issue of water, that's something that we need to be afraid of because, we are 10 times smaller than the U.S., give or take, right? A bit. The one thing that prevents us from being pushed around by the U.S., from being bullied around, is the existence of this complex web of institutions, rules, norms. And I realize very well that a lot of people roll their eyes as soon as you start talking about institutions and norms and rules and so on. That's what allows smaller states to hold firm against bigger states in international politics. That's why a world in which again, this term has become so politicized, including because Chrystia Freeland uses it, the rules-based international order. Put aside all the politics. That's what allows smaller states like Canada to not be pushed around and bullied by a bigger state like the U.S. In a world where these institutions, the Water Commission or the dozens of other ones, NORAD, Five Eyes, and so on, become weakened, they don't even have to be destroyed, become weakened, which is very clearly what Trump wants to do, we are much more vulnerable to a world, a dynamic in which power, sheer power, is the key determinant in shaping the extremely complex interactions we have with the U.S. Of course, power matters today, but power is diluted by the existence of that web of institutions because that protects us against the arbitrariness of the use of American power to bully us around. Just one small point. I travel to the Middle East a lot for the other, I focus on that Canadian national security, but also on the Middle East a lot. I was in Bahrain just last week for a regional security conference. One conversation that I love to have in the Persian Gulf is in talking to small countries like Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, to compare their relation with their giant neighbor Saudi Arabia, not Iran, which is the enemy, but Saudi Arabia, which is their partner. And it's really interesting to compare how is it managing relations with a big neighbor that is on your team, but it's complicated. And they get pushed around so much more than we do because they don't have the luxury, and really it's a luxury, of that web of institutions that protects us. So my fear in a post, rules-based international order world, or whatever we want to call it, is the weakening of these institutions exposes us to be to a dynamic where American power is the key driver of the bilateral relationship, and that is really not good news for us.
Final question. Do you think, given everything, despite everything you've just said, that the ties that bind us to the US are strong enough to resist another 4 years of Donald Trump?
So obviously the first answer is I hope so, but I think it would be extraordinarily irresponsible for any government. And again, when I say that it's not a partisan issue, I mean that it'll be a problem for a conservative or a liberal one to hope for the best. Because the best might happen. Biden might win again. And again, I don't mean that in any kind of partisan terms. Biden has had his, has done things, Keystone Inflation Reduction Act. By and large, he's in the continuity of Republican and Democratic administrations that have been good for Canada, that have been extremely good for Canada. Trump would be a game changer, Trump too. There's a bit of talk these days of Nikki Haley, rising as the one challenger to Trump. I just saw that the Koch brothers are now throwing their weight behind Nikki Haley because they've been anti-Trump for a while. But as you said, at least 80% chance, according to betting markets, that Trump wins. We can't hope for the best. We have to plan for the worst, because the worst is not a 1 or 2% probability scenario. It's a 50-50 one. Give or take a few percentage points. We have to plan for that. A lot of the planning, the big problem with what I'm saying is that it's in the long term. There's not that much that we can do in the next 6 or 12 months, but we can still lay the groundwork and at least be ready to hit the ground running more than we would if we weren't prepared. You talk about the web of institutions and the proximity of these ties. You could absolutely imagine scenarios where, yes, Trump wins. Yes, he tries to do a lot of the really difficult things from our perspective in terms of protectionism and isolationism. And then the donut strategy works. There is resistance in Congress. There is resistance at the state level. Business associations, some of which have managed to keep some good ties with Trump and his family. They push back. And we do manage to carve out some exemptions for Canada. NATO is weakened, but it survives. The Five Eyes continue under the radar, which is a certainly plausible scenario, because within the, quote unquote, deep state in the US that Trump dislikes so much, the Five Eyes is valued extremely highly. Not just because of Canada, of course, but also the UK and Australia. So you can see a scenario which is an unstable scenario, a scary scenario for Canada, a highly uncertain and volatile one, but where the damage is contained. So I absolutely don't want to give the impression that if Trump wins, 100% all of these worst-case scenarios materialize. But they are not far-fetched. They are real concerns, and we do have to think about them. And the impression I get is that we're really not at the point where we need to be.
Very sobering discussion, Thomas. Many thanks for coming on. Thanks again.
Thank you.